A Barcelona hospital is trying to keep spirits high as a second wave of COVID-19 hits Spain. They're giving long-term ICU patients a break from the constant buzzing of machines, bringing them to the beach for some ocean breezes instead.
In Spain, the number of people who have died with the coronavirus has risen again.
The first wave was very horrifying.
Spain, France and Belgium have all strengthened local health rules and in some cases imposed localised lockdowns amid fears of a second wave of the virus.
In August, it started the second wave. Patients rush to the hospital with worries. In this second wave, more than in the first wave, they know what could happen when they have to be admitted in the ICU. This program includes different activities that are directed to improve the mental well-being and the mood of critical patients. Our ICU is in the ground floor in the hospital. This specific activity consists in to bring the patients to the Barcelona seafront. This is a therapeutic activity. Patients, they have to face a very difficult situations in the ICU. We in the Hospital del Mar, we have the privilege to be very, very close to the Barcelona seafront. We just have to cross a street and we are in the seafront, so the hospital is in the beach. We stay in the seafront around 15, 20 minutes. Our mission and our role is to taking care about this mental or psychological well-being.
And what's the emotional reaction like when you go down to the beach with the patient and you see them smile and you see them happy with their family? What does that feel like for you?
Yeah, it's the best moment. Sometimes they can express that emotion. Sometimes it's more difficult, but it's obvious that the result is positive. The image of a patient crossing the street here in Barcelona is powerful, but the most powerful thing is it's all the work that there is behind this image and all the positive results that we obtain with that program.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.